Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the IREC presentation on grid equity and energy justice in integrated distribution planning. We're going to get started here in a few minutes. We appreciate you being with us. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? And if anyone else joins, we'll have them filter in. It's great to have people here. I think, as both of you know, my name is Vaughn Woodruff. I am the VP of Regulatory Reform at the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. And I'm here just to set the table for Shay Banton, who you'll hear from shortly, who's our regulatory program engineer and energy justice policy advocate. If you could go ahead and advance the slide, Melody, I appreciate it. So IREC is a nonprofit organization that's been around for 40 years, and we build the foundation for rapid adoption of clean energy and energy efficiency to benefit people, the economy, and our planet. We have three teams within IREC. We have a workforce development team, we have a local initiatives team, and then our team is the regulatory team, whose mission it is to help U.S. states and territories regulate their electric utilities to ensure that DERs such as solar, energy storage, and EV infrastructure can rapidly and equitably decarbonize the grid. We structure our work into five initiatives. The first four are focused on how we maximize the hosting capacity of the grid that we have today, and that we do through smart DER siting with tools such as hosting capacity maps, effective queue reporting, and pre-applications that help to ensure that projects that are applying to interconnect to the grid are more likely to have high approval rates. We then also have another initiative focused on innovative DER integration. So when there are grid constraints, we want to make sure that we're able to fully leverage various technologies to help increase the ability for DERs to be hosted on the grid, and we do that through engagement in the development of standards for smart inverters, the deployment of energy storage through effective interconnection rules across the country, and then flexible interconnection, which is a fast emerging topic around the country. Third, and one of the things that we've done for 20 years is that we have helped to maintain the best practices for regulation of DER interconnection through our model interconnection procedures. And we really help focus on how we can rapidly approve projects that ensure safety and reliability for the grid. In addition to our model interconnection procedures, we do an assessment called Freeing the Grid that helps rate states based on how well their procedures align with best practices. And in addition to that work, we are engaged and often intervene in state proceedings to help strengthen interconnection rules across the country. And then lastly, the passage of interconnection rules is one part of the equation. The other part is ensuring that that utilities are in compliance with those rules. And so we help support regulators and other parties in terms of providing technical assistance and clarity to help resolve issues that arrive when interconnection rules aren't necessarily being implemented in alignment with standard utility practices. And then lastly, but not leastly, I don't think that's a word, but we're going to use it today, is our clean and equitable grid. And so as the first four focus on the grid that we have today and how we maximize its hosting capacity, our clean and equitable grid initiative, which Shay leads, helps to make sure that the grid that we need to move to 100% clean energy future is taking into account the benefits from DERs and also making sure that it's done in a manner that's equitable for all ratepayers. So for today's webinar, we have a small group here, and as I think all of you were here for the first session that we had related to IDP. Feel free to throw a question in the chat box. If you would like to, you can raise your hand if you have questions that come up. We really want this to be an interactive presentation today. We have some conversations that will go on as part of the presentation. So by all means, as you see opportunities to either engage with the content that Shay's presenting, or just need a clarifier in order to help you understand the material as we move forward, please, by all means, either throw a question in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand. Closed captioning is enabled. You can select the show caption from the control toolbar at the bottom of the screen to enable that. Don't see any AI bots on here. If there are any note takers that show up, we do not allow AI note takers or bot participation, so those will be removed and not allowed to re-enter. And then lastly, we will, as we did with the last presentation, we will send around a follow-up email with resources that are mentioned, as well as the slides and the recording of this session after the event. And then finally for today, our big picture objectives are really to shine a light on a comprehensive and cohesive understanding of what grid equity means and provide a guiding framework for examining it. We're going to identify equity intersections across the integrated distribution planning objectives and propose standard procedures for putting together really effective grid equity assessments. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shay, who will be your guide in this really lovely topic. So thank you very much, Shay.
Thanks so much, Vaughn. Really appreciate it, and really great to see you all again. Really excited to talk about this topic. Grid equity is a budding research space, and it's growing increasingly more important, especially as climate change, rears its ugly head. So we're gonna talk through quickly the agenda. First, we're gonna start with defining grid equity, what it is, and ultimately why it's important as a concept in utility regulation. Two, we're gonna look at frameworks for grid equity and how grid planning can promote a more equitable grid. Three, intersections with integrated distribution planning. So we'll talk about those different intersections with objectives, and we'll actually work together to examine some of those areas, depending on what your own priorities are in IDP objectives. And then we'll talk about grid equity assessments themselves, where have they been performed, what components went into them, what are some strategies to deploy them, and things like that. So with that, we'll jump into defining grid equity. We'll take this kind of in a four piecemeal approach. We'll start with the why. We think grid equity is an important objective in utility regulation. Who is really the focus of grid equity? What are the parties that have been kind of overlooked and that are kind of being uplifted by even the concept or the consideration of grid equity? Then we'll look into some guiding frameworks and lenses in which to apply when examining grid equity. And then we'll actually get into the next section, the how we ourselves interpret and digest, all of the work in this topic into a subset of frames that are really helpful in examining certain areas of grid planning and interconnection and anything related to electric system management regulation. So let's move into the why. So obviously the first and foremost, most important aspect of, I guess any clean energy work that we do is ensuring that we have a just transition. I know people are probably very familiar with this definition from IEJ, but just restate it because I think it's a really great grounding principle. So again, a just transition in ensuring it is redressing the legacy energy systems disinvestment and equitable distribution of harms to frontline, BIPOC, and economically and medically disadvantaged communities, and then creating an energy system that uplifts people, right? That supports the regenerative economy, honors workers, redresses past harms, and creates new relationships of power for the future through through reparations. So that's the overarching frame and kind of grounding value set that we want to go forward when we're thinking about examining grid planning and interconnection and IDP through an equity lens. Next slide. And when you think about a lot of the newer research and efforts in grid equity, one of the first questions is how do we qualify? How we determine success towards an equitable grid? And so this is where kind of the grid equity concept has come into play. So when we think about that question of grid equity, we're not just thinking about, oh, just lenses and frameworks, right? We're thinking about what are some, specific steps? What are the actual metrics? What are the values that we want to monitor and track in order to show over time that we're progressing towards a more equitable grid? And I'm so sorry if there's a little background noise, but a little bit of a public space. Please let me know if it gets a little out of hand. I can definitely move. Some qualifiers of success that we really think about when we're trying to examine or think about grid equity are, defining metrics that, are relevant to the communities of interest, and to the parties that are regulating, and what they find are feasible and acceptable at that time. Two is, using those metrics to track progress towards, your equity objectives. Three is prioritizing deployment of various solutions that achieve and move towards those objectives. And then finally is, quantifying the impact of the decisions that were made, and seeing if the solutions that were deployed that were hoping to move the ball forward, if they actually worked, right? So that's why grid equity is an important concept, because it's, again, just trying to say, how do we reach the equitable grid? And so we have some ideas of the groundwork, and we have some ideas of what we're trying to achieve. So that's the why. Next slide. So the who of grid equity. So there's ultimately a reason why, we're performing grid equity in general, and it's ultimately to uplift communities that have been harmed by previous, planning efforts that have overlooked them and their needs and the capabilities that the electric system is supposed to provide them with, or have, been kind of abused by energy system planning, or environmental injustices that occur through the planning of coal plants or the disinvestment into grid infrastructure, whatever it may be. We want to definitely make sure that we uplift the voices that have been overlooked in these proceedings. And so we kind of dial these down into three main buckets. First is disadvantaged communities. Obviously, those who have been overlooked in the policy development process. Then we have under-resourced communities. This is really getting into the capability gap, in that some communities are unable to participate effectively, either through procedural barriers that were kind of created without their participation in mind, or that they lack maybe technical or procedural or legal expertise to participate effectively. And so that gap has to be alleviated as well. And then we finally have disinvesting communities. This is a large point in which grid equity, I think, has really shined a light on, which is recognizing that there are legacies of, decisions that we've made in the past, or regulatory compacts and regulatory decisions that were made, that were supposed to be kind of blind and not really consider impact, and just kind of be a fair assessment and applied to everyone, but realizing that that actually has resulted in neglect to certain communities. And so recognizing that that every decision can have an impact, and so you have to make sure you evaluate those impacts. So disinvested communities, we want to make sure that grid equity alleviates and reinvest in those communities to allow them to participate in the clean energy future, and have a resilient energy infrastructure. Next slide. So moving beyond the who, and moving on to some additional guiding frameworks and lessons that have been applied in developing the ideas around grid equity. Talked about energy justice previously and the just transition, but I think it's important again to reframe these again and get it in front of everyone's mind. So first is recognitional justice. Probably very familiar with this, but it's identification, understanding, and outreach. So it's making sure that those disadvantaged members, right, who have not been involved, have been overlooked, are brought to the table, and are identified upfront, and their needs are identified, so you can address them through other means. Then you have procedures, which is the act. So after identifying, it's the pulling and the bringing in, and the also meeting people where they're at, to allow for meaningful involvement and a distribution of decision-making power. This is also where the term accessibility is really, really key. How do we make sure that parties of different, cultural backgrounds, language, backgrounds, whatever it may be, are allowed to participate effectively? We have distributive this is probably what's considered, I think, most of the time when we think about equity in certain contexts. It's really the distribution of costs and benefits and prioritization. We did talk a bit about this at last week's slide with the cost allocation component of things, but we didn't really talk about a lot of the prioritization components, which we'll touch on today. And then we have reparative, right? Righting past wrongs and alleviating disparate burdens. This is also a main focus of grid equity, and that we'll be talking about today in terms of recognizing, identifying where wrongs have occurred, and where disinvestment has occurred, and addressing that proactively, and prioritizing that. And finally, just transition objectives, from advancing energy democracy to alleviating energy insecurity and reducing energy burden and alleviating energy poverty. These are all concepts that people, I'm sure, are very familiar with. But if you're not, I can definitely provide some resources from IEJ and other resources that really get into like the philosophical underlying and rationale for why these are so important and how they impact people. I definitely also recommend the book Powerless if you haven't heard about that. It's a really great book on this exact topic. Next slide. So now that we've walked through some of those guiding principles, thought we would jump into some of the early work in grid equity and energy justice related topics. The first and probably the most well known is the IEJ's Energy Justice Scorecard, basically a self-assessment tool to assess one's, one's internal processes and regulatory process and procedures to see if they are adhering to kind of those larger themes of energy justice. So it's very qualitative in nature, and somewhat isolated, and very internal, or uh, looking internal into oneself. Next slide. You then have kind of advancements in the space in which efforts from certain labs have tried to, conceptualize or bridge those larger frameworks into more quantitative metrics. Or even some qualitative here as well. So you can't really see this here, but I'll share this paper with you all. But ideas here from WNL is, yeah, how to transition or how to, translate, the ideas of distributive and recognitional justice into what it means from a regulatory compact and regulatory metric standard. So that's very much aligned with grid equity. A lot of these metrics haven't really been deployed widespread, but I'll go into detail about which ones have been and what are the challenges undergone in those processes. Next slide. And then, yeah, here's an example of one of those actually, a real grid equity assessment performed by University of Maryland and University of Minnesota. My gosh. And you can see on this little chart, this is just a brief overview that I'll talk about a little bit later, about disparities in service quality based on a certain reliability metric that better quantifies the individual experience of different communities. And so this is kind of the next level, right? So now that we've talked about the frameworks, we've talked about like where we could go with metrics, this is now defining those metrics, defining a reliability variable, and then actually assessing it across different communities to determine if differences are there. And then now you can seek to prioritize reinvesting and addressing those disparities. So these are all things that we've kind of taken into account in our own assessment of what grid equity means. And so we'll put those all together. Next slide. So the first party to really define grid equity was Volt Solar, and they have a really simple, sweet, and I think a really robust definition. And so it's ensuring that the electric distribution grid serves all customers equitably. We completely agree with that. Except I guess me as an overthinker, I definitely wanted to have something a little bit more robust and something that actually identified all of the components and pieces that we're really concerned about. And so here we actually expanded that definition here at IREC. Next slide. That includes, it's pretty long, but I think it does kind of capture all of the angles, all the perspectives that comes at the intersection of all the past research and efforts that have been done in this space. So in our definition, grid equity is the intentional, community informed, and where possible, community led design, regulation, operation, and investment in the electric distribution system to ensure that all customers, especially those historically underserved or marginalized have reliable, affordable, resilient access to a decarbonized distributed energy electric grid. So it's definitely for reading, not for saying. It's definitely a long one, but we think that it does really capture a lot of these aspects and these areas that we think are really, really important, that have been informed by those past research efforts and framework development. So starting here, though, we're going to take a short pause and see how Maine themselves, stakeholders in Maine, have defined or alluded to, grid equity aspects, as well as how you would kind of look at both of these definitions and change them yourselves. Like, what would you like to see changed, or who is currently being overlooked? And so, yeah, I want to definitely open up the floor and see what you all think about Maine and the context of defining grid equity in your utility regulation. No worries if there's no comments.
Oh,
Anything, Vaughn?
sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
I was on mute. But Steve has his hand up, but I didn't do that part. I'll let Steve go and then I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Kira. I saw that you were trying to talk, but I can go after you.
No, it's just been one of those days. I appreciate it. Thanks, Steve. Um, Shay, I started with a thank you that was, very poignant. But I do appreciate the presentation today. My background has focused a lot on low income and moderate income households in Maine and ensuring benefit programs for affordable utility service. But I think this concept for me and these definitions still feel a little bit abstract in how I'm trying to envision grid equity, right? Is that making sure that distributed generation projects are built in areas so that they're near all income bases? Is it to make sure that we're not building too many in low income neighborhoods because land is less expensive? And is that one of the areas of inequity? Or I I guess I'm struggling to define the universe of problems that we're trying to solve here, and that definition is great, but it's almost too big for me to conceptualize what we're actually after. And if you could help me put some framework around that, that would be so appreciated.
no, that is, I think, wonderful, wonderful feedback. Thank you. And also thank you for the kind words. Um, I we will touch on some of the more defined metrics later on in the presentation, the defined areas in which we think there are opportunities to consider those specifics of grid equity. So I think the intersection of this and the IDP project or IDP objectives in general yields some of that detailed information. And this is largely a more grounding, or like recognizing that if we're not moving towards, if anything what we're doing does not move us towards this direction or align with this definition, then we probably not the thing we should be doing. But I agree that there are those tension areas, especially that one you mentioned, the clean energy development in communities without abusing communities and benefiting, make sure they benefit communities. That is a key tension area across the landscape. But I definitely I'll hold that thought because I think we'll definitely get to a little bit more detail on that later.
Thank you.
And Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Shay. Yeah, I think, this definition captures a lot of things in it, and I think it's got a lot of the right elements in it from my perspective. I do think, the first part of it talking about getting input from the communities that have been affected is really important. It's something that UCS and some of the other NGOs that commented in Maine's grid planning process had suggested. And I know that the utilities are doing community outreach meetings where they're trying to also assess, and get some input from the communities on what's important. And I know in some other jurisdictions, there's been a more proactive process that even includes the communities, leading, like you're saying, community-led I know some examples of that occurring in some other states that that's also, I think, a good element. In the comments that we submitted on the grid planning process in Maine, they were pretty extensive comments, so I won't go into too much detail, but we basically were making an argument that the utility should be required to assess both the positive and negative impacts of the grid plans on these communities. And in Maine, well, first of all, the requirement in the grid plan included environmental environmental equity and environmental justice impacts. It described it in that way. So those are not all the same thing. They've captured different things, but the framework that we were advocating for, we thought that it was important to include quantifiable metrics, not just qualitative ones like you described before. And we included several examples of that. But I think the framework that we wanted to see was, sort of a clear identification and definition of what specific costs and benefits were going to be included, quantifying how much benefits would be resulting from grid plan investments. And then third, really importantly, tracking and reporting on who's receiving the benefits to help evaluate that progress. So that was sort of, at a high level, what we included, and I'd be happy to talk in more detail about some of the specific examples. But yeah, so let me just leave it there for now, I guess.
Thank you so much, Steve. That's wonderful, wonderful feedback. Yeah, definitely agree with the need for quantifiable metrics, which we'll touch on with some of the grid equity assessments that have been performed both by us and by other parties. We'll also talk, as tracking and reporting is one of the main aspects of the framework that we're proposing here, and some of the details that we talked about in the different assessments. Yeah, that is super important. But what?
I
No,
would
go
also
ahead.
just quickly add, and you guys might be aware of this, but the commission in their final order on the grid planning basically didn't was not prescriptive about what costs and benefits should be included. It basically left it up to the utilities to decide, and to, recognizing that this is the first grid planning process that the utilities are going through, that there would be, a periodic assessment of it, and evaluation and, improvement over time as they have more experience with future grid plans.
Absolutely. I did see that in the order. Yeah, they just said utility develop metrics and frames. And so that's definitely something I was a little worried about. Looking excited to talk a little bit more about what you all recommended, as well as what maybe has been talked about, proposed since. Hopefully there's been some updates there. I know it's not due till later this year, right? The IGPs with these final frameworks. So perfect. Any other thoughts? I'll go to Steve.
Deadline is early next year. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. With that, we'll move on. We can skip 2 slides. Yeah, so now we'll talk about what the proposed framework that we have here for grid equity is. Next slide. So this framework has another end of thinking about abstract ideas. We'll get into the more detailed a little bit very, very soon. But thinking a little bit more abstractly in from a 1,000-foot view, there are 3 main aspects that we see as key to enabling at least robust grid equity conversations, and enabling assessments to take place, and targets to be tracked and progress to be made across grid equity. And so by filling these 3 roles, you are hopefully moving towards a more equitable grid. The first has been tantamount to IREC's mission across the space is data transparency. Next slide. And data transparency is grid data must be easily accessible, highly visible, and integrated with justice-centered metrics to ensure that decision-making authority is appropriately shared. And I want to highlight that second part specifically, that decision-making is, sorry, this mosquito, that decision-making authority is shared with data. So if you have sufficient data to assess and view the disparate impacts, identify disparate impacts, you then have now effectively distributed that power to advocacy groups and people who need to, better advocate for the changes that they see are fit in alignment with their own objectives and goals. So that's a very, very, very almost rudimentary, but like very grounded component of the framework is data transparency. We'll talk a little bit more about the details soon about what data should be shared and for what reasons. Next slide. Next is inclusive decision making. This one I think is pretty clear across everyone, but grid planning must be accessible and inclusive of all affected communities, ensuring that historically marginalized have meaningful voice in shaping the future of the energy system. Don't think I have to put me on that. I think this is something that Maine has done pretty well. Some territories have done also pretty well in development of certain groups, but there's still significant challenges in terms of the accessibility component. We deal with pretty highly technical topics, and so how do you dial down utility related planning strategies and reliability metrics and rate structures and things like that into something that communities care about and can access and effectively provide feedback on. And we'll talk a lot here about translating a lot of this information into capabilities is really important. How do people use the grid and interact with it? And that's the intersection that we want to focus on when communicating with communities. Next slide. The final is investment prioritization, right? So we want to make sure that if all the other objectives are fulfilled, that we then create a way to ensure that investments into grid capital and utility services are prioritized and address known disparities and enhance opportunities to previously underserved and disinvested populations. So this is very much in alignment with the end objectives, right? The end goal. But there are some, we'll talk about this in a second, how, investments can actually benefit the other two objective areas and actually enable a stronger cycle of grid equity understanding. And this will be shown in the next slide. So we have, you can click through, sorry about those. So we have these kind of intersections between the frameworks just to highlight how they interact with one another and can benefit one another. So I think it's pretty clear that I've mentioned this, but data transparency is a very foundational component, right? And having sufficient data transparency, it empowers communities to quantify the disparities. Again, quantify, since a lot of regulation is built on quantification, and then to advocate for the solutions, so enabling a more inclusive decision-making landscape. By making it a more inclusive landscape and increasing the capacity of participants, either through data and access to consultants and specialists, supporting them through legal advocacy and things like that. That all strengthens participatory justice and allows ultimately for more informed prioritization across the board. So it's not just saying that we want access to something, that we want cheaper rates, that we want cheaper rates at this rate, because this is what we found is an effective rate for communities, or that we recognize that there's, well, actually, we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'll jump into that. Don't want to jump too far ahead. And then finally, investment prioritization ultimately doesn't have to just be focused on the grid infrastructure investments. A lot of the benefit of having these community decisions in other states has been the ability to then prioritize improvements to data accessibility and tracking that enable further insight and allow for more robust discussions. More robust discussions on what inequities may exist. And so there's what I'm trying to show here is that there's definitely some connection and some looping that can happen in this kind of framework. And so recognizing that using any one of these in a certain way can really benefit decision-making power across the board. Next slide. So let's go ahead and jump into some of the activities. This is where we'll get into some of the meat and potatoes and talk about some of the solutions. Before we get into the grid equity assessments, which we'll touch on the specific aspects. So when we think about this framework, we think back to the reason why we're doing this training, integrated distribution planning, and centering energy equity in that process. Grid equity is really the intersection across grid energy equity in all these areas of IDP. And so what I'm going to have us do here is actually apply these specific lenses, again, focusing on data, focusing on prioritization, focusing on decision making, and see what kind of is yielded as a group in terms of opportunities and challenges. Next slide. So we're going to start with an example, starting with safety and reliability and resiliency, and viewed through the perspective of data transparency, inclusive decision making, and investment prioritization. Next slide. So what I did here was just like a kind of rudimentary examination of each of these objective areas across each of these framework components. And what I'm going to ask after we walk through this is that you all as a group together, we're going to try to apply this to a particular objective area that you're interested in. But let's highlight, some of these intersections. As you can see, some of them are duplicative, but because sometimes they relate. But for instance, let's say reliability, one area that has been challenging in reliability and for community advocacy efforts has been the utilization of, pretty not rudimentary, but old metrics, reliability metrics on a system-wide basis that end up ultimately hiding disparities that could exist on people at the edges of reliability inadequacy of the system. And so one solution that has been deployed, like in Minnesota, has been distribution system maps, similar to host capacity maps, that actually show reliability data, right? And then could be accessed and reviewed and assessed to determine and uncover whether or not reliability, as it pertains to specific communities and the demographics of those communities, are there now differences that can be estimated. So in recognizing that there's an in recognizing that reliability has a data transparency issue, you can then solve and find an answer or potentially propose a solution, which could be reliability maps or just the instantiation of more granular service metrics, which we can talk a little bit later. Looking at inclusive decision making and let's say resiliency, for instance. This is an area that has been a really hard, I think, topic, especially on the West Coast, with utilities dealing with the impact of climate change and wildfire propagation, especially those caused by electric infrastructure, and kind of a basically lack of interest in talking to communities about their own ability to advocate for what they would like to see changed in the system or how they would like to respond to wildfire risk. And what has come out of that in terms of recognizing that the need there and the challenges. Actually, I'll quantify this a little bit more detailed. Like for instance, utilities would started to really look towards investing in undergrounding of transmission infrastructure. Pretty intensive investments, but also it causes a lot of huge rate spikes on communities. But if I guess if there was a lack of community engagement in decision making, a lot of those decisions probably would have went through. It would have been really costly to ratepayers overall. But there were discussions with community members about how they would like to invest and what they would like to see done. And as a result of those communications, and some investments in like PG&E territory actually prioritized not the reinvestment into transmission infrastructure that was prone to wildfire risk and making those climate risk averse. Instead, actually, deploying local distribution solutions like microgrid deployments in wildfire risk areas, so that when wildfire season occurs, that you can then actually store energy on site with, in this case, utility-owned infrastructure, so it doesn't cause too much financial burden on communities, and therefore reducing wildfire propagation risk across those wide swaths with those transmission infrastructure used to run. And so that's been, a huge plus, and a lot of communities have been really excited about that. It's also a solution that has been, deployed in even not in wildfire risk areas. So in areas that are just looking to increase their own energy resilience when they have really unreliable energy infrastructure. And so that is, let's say, tribal communities in the Midwest or North. Yes, some parts of the West Coast areas that, yeah, have had difficulty with reliability from utilities. And so being able to have the option and opportunity to address it through microgrid development has been a really great benefit. So this is just a kind of overarching like idea of what we're kind of trying to do today and see if this kind of works. We're definitely testing this out with you all, so I hope you're excited to try. Next slide. What we're going to do is we're going to apply this. We were going to have a breakout group because we don't have enough people today, but we're going to basically together select an IDP objective and then identify some of the intersections that we think could be potential solutions and opportunities, or maybe are just currently challenges in the space that we would like to see addressed. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and open it up. I'd like to hear first and foremost if anyone has any ideas about a specific IDP objective that they're most interested in examining. I'll put those in the chat right now as a reminder. And I can read them off as well. But it's safety, reliability, resiliency, affordability, proactive host capacity, electrification and decarbonization, grid modernization, and climate adaptation and mitigation. So yeah, any ideas on an IDP objective we'd like to examine as a group?
Um, I, I'll, everybody's on mute, so I'll jump in again, Shay. I think if we could start with electrification and decarbonization. I feel like we can touch on a number of those objectives within that.
That sounds great. Any other thoughts? I'm definitely fine with going electrification. That sounds great to me. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that one came top of mind because I just learned about a subsection of a statute that's been on the books in Maine since the late 80s, that specifically talks about older populations and limiting it. Basically exists on the books prior to beneficial electrification and then moves there. And so it talks about stable rates and not increasing usage and flat rates, and it has verbiage in it that really is looking at the world prior to beneficial electrification. And so I think one of the big challenges is that we face there is not only do we have public interest and engagement awareness, but we have statutory obligations that may be in conflict with some of our current policies today.
And you said the statutory requirements is the flat rate. Is that what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'll pull the language because it's a really interesting statute that I only found out about in comments in another docket filed from AARP. Fortunately, they were aware of it, but yeah, it's from 1987, and basically, let me see here, service to older citizens, and at the same time encourage as well as reward the conservation of scarce energy supplies by adopting the approach of constant per unit cost for the use of electricity. It is the policy of the state that older citizens be able to receive transmission and distribution service for basic necessities of modern life at a stable, fair, and reasonable minimum cost to encourage the reduction of electricity consumption for all other uses beyond such basic necessities. And I'm pretty well versed in Title 35A and have never come across that before. And it is in direct conflict with a number of our other policy objectives stated within the same title, but I think, it just goes to prove, I think, the complexities of the challenges and opportunities here. Look at that, Bond. Thank you.
Wow, that's a very interesting challenge. And let's dive into that. And I see, Steve, I see your hand up. Let's definitely just, if you don't mind, if we can dive into this particular comment real quick, and then we'll see what other, unless you want to contribute to that one specifically.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm totally fine with using that electrification decarbonization. I just wanted to say that I mean, just to clarify that, of course, Maine's utilities are distribution utilities. They're not responsible for generation, and so the state does have decarbonization goals. A bill was just signed into law a couple days ago requiring 100% clean electricity by 2040. And then the electrification, a lot of that's being done by entities like Efficiency Maine, encouraging investment in heat pumps and EVs and that type of thing. But that being said, as part of the grid planning process, the utilities have to take those things into account into their forecasts, the impacts of electrification, and obviously like how the grid's going to be affected by some of the decarbonization initiatives, whether they be, large scale projects or even, sort of, or more importantly, DERs and, small scale solar and other DERs that are also going to be included in their forecast. So I think it's a good thing to highlight, but just that also highlighting that other entities beyond the utilities are also responsible for some of these things.
Thank you so much, Steve. Absolutely. Jumping into this particular challenging area of electrification, right? And the fact that this particular statute does complicate things in terms of the larger objectives of grid equity with clean energy deployment and energy resilience do cost money, right? And that leads to rate increases, and that is in contrast with the statute that says that you want to lower the burden for communities or for particular members of society that are very stable in their electric output, aren't looking to increase their utilization of grid capabilities, like other customers are with DER integration and electric vehicle adoption and the like, I'm guessing. So that's definitely an interesting contrast area. I just want to highlight or jump into the data transparency components and wondering what has on this particular topic in this particular subset of the community, what efforts have been undergone and are currently understood in effort to fulfill the statute to understand the breadth of this community and their needs and requirements under a changing climate and electric infrastructure, electric system, yeah.
Yeah, I think personally we found the data a bit challenging depending on, right, Maine's one of the oldest states, if not the oldest state in the nation, and so we have a large percentage of older Mainers. But I think we really highlight the differences in usage patterns when you look at the households that choose to participate in our low-income electricity subsidy programs. They tend to have higher than average electricity usage. The average household in Maine uses, depending on which utility you're in, 500 to 550 kilowatt hours a month. And we find that households that are participating in our benefit program, a large percentage of those are older Mainers, use more than that, but where the data breaks down is when you're trying to obtain usage data for older citizens on the whole, whether they participate in that program or not. And we have only about a 40% adoption and uptake rate in the subsidy program. So I think it makes it really difficult to pass generalizations. Like my grandmother-in-law, right? She's the stereotypical little French woman who is going to turn on one light bulb, make one cup of coffee a day, and then turn off that light bulb and not use any other electricity until the sun goes down. She wasn't in any benefit program, and she's not using more than the average household, but we also don't have any data on that other than anecdotal, right? Because it's not data that's readily collected and made available by the utility. So I think that's one of the struggles that I have on data is trying to accurately capture the usage needs and the affordability burdens of that population.
Very interesting challenge. I do not have an answer, but I'm excited. But that is a really, really interesting one. I know that I'm curious with Carnegie Mellon's work, which I'll reference a little bit later, on the specific issue in Arizona, where they investigated energy consumption differentials across different socioeconomic variables, whether or not that resulted or how they examined that particular gap in data. So I at least have a person to talk to examine that question. So we'll definitely think about that a little bit further. But any other additional ideas for potential challenges, solutions, and opportunities when it comes to electrification and data transparency?
I would just say that there is data that can be accessible though too, which is like I'm just thinking of first of all, like one of the biggest drivers for disadvantaged or environmental justice communities in Maine is income, as Kira was indicating, more so than race and more so than English proficiency and things like that. It's really income levels. And so we do have data on where where these communities are located across the state that definitely correlates with lower income communities in a lot of cases, and also data from entities like Efficiency Maine and the utilities that show where investments and incentives and so forth are occurring for things like heat pumps and other investments in electrification, EVs, and other things. And so that there's some historic data there, but then I think it's also important to think moving forward where some of those investments should go in the future that could help provide benefits to those communities and help lower energy burden. And one thing I guess that's worth mentioning here is that with electrification, you're going to increase electricity bills will likely go up, but your other energy bills are going to go down. So that's important to take into mind when you're thinking about how the benefits are accrue and how much benefit is being how much benefit is happening. So I just want to flag a couple of those things where there is data available and where as the grid plans are being built out, in thinking about where DERs are going to be deployed, where the investments in the the distribution system are going to go to, and how those benefits flow to some of those communities as well, in terms of dollars invested, in terms of some jobs in those communities are part of it too. So those are a couple ways to look at it, I think.
Oh, that's really, really great. And I'm curious about, you mentioned that income being the primary driver. What has that been? Yeah, I'm wondering or curious as to how that determination was made in terms of the recognition that income was the primary driver or primary variable versus those other socioeconomic or demographic variables that were accessible. Was there an assessment across those metrics to like weigh out which metric was most important, or did it just kind of seem like the benefits seem to align most closely to income related concerns?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So as part of another docket at the PUC related to intervener and participant funding, some of the groups that I work with that were submitting joint comments actually did quantified, put forth a definition for environmental justice that included income, race, English proficiency based on some of the screening tools that were available at the federal level that aren't being used anymore, but also criteria that has also been used in other states that have developed state-specific EJ definitions. And there's been legislation in Maine for the past. There's legislation this year. There's legislation the last couple of years to try to create a state-specific EJ definition. So a lot of it's based on that, but I'd be happy to share some of that information with you offline if you're interested.
Yeah, sounds great. We can definitely link up on that a little bit later. You also highlighted the forecasting challenge, right? So, yeah, effectively prioritizing these investments to alleviate those energy burdens in the future. As we know, energy prices are going up with certain investments. So that's a very important challenge to identify, is the forecasting challenge. That is another one that CMU tackled, Carnegie Mellon tackled, in terms of consumption patterns, and usage rates of certain cooling infrastructure, which is important in Arizona for sure. But definitely something to be, I think I'm going to catalog as an important aspect, is recognizing the differences in forecasting between communities in areas of interest is a really important variable to account for sure. Awesome. I think let's go ahead and move on to inclusive decision making. So we talked about a lot of these data challenges, and oh, can we maintain on that slide? Sorry about that. We talked about a lot of the yeah, a lot of the current um, opaque areas that we currently can't see into, or that when we can, it may not capture everyone that we want to see, and that there are certain conditions we want to model out to the future for those communities that we also are currently invisible. So those are really interesting problems to be addressed. From the inclusive decision making place, I'm wondering how well, I guess one glaring, actually, I'll pause. One glaring procedural challenge I personally saw in reviewing some of the decision that you mentioned, Steve, was the fact that the metrics themselves were being proposed kind of solely and in isolation by utilities versus being prescriptive or developed through a working group process. I'm wondering, have there been, or do you agree with that assumption that maybe there wasn't as an inclusive decision-making process in even the development of the or current development of the equity related metrics, or EEEJ related metrics deployed in Maine, or to be deployed?
Well, I would say that there's still an unknown there, because the utilities are in the middle of doing their good planning process right now, and I think they're about to report on the second milestone out of three. And I think my understanding anyways is that the environmental equity and EJ assessment, I always get tripped up on it. It's long title, is part of the third milestone. So, the meetings that I've been part of with the utilities and as part of the grid planning process, I've raised it several times about wanting to know what they're thinking about that part of it. And, I have a testimony that we worked on and submitted that had a lot of details in it about what they could do. So, I think it's still kind of unclear yet what they're going to include, or what they want to include, and if there's going to be more discussion about it, as they're pursuing this third milestone.
Is there any concern that it's at the end of the process versus at the beginning, or informing a lot of the decisions? So I could see how I would develop certain forecasting processes and reliability related investment processes, and then go to an equity component and have not evaluated or considered how those reliability metrics or things like that could have been changed preemptively. Yeah, I'm just interested in, do you find any concern about it being the third phase, or do you think it's actually structured in a way that could result in, a more inclusive decision-making landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question, a great point. I think there's a problem with in doing it in that sort of sequence. But I do think that I know that the utilities have been doing community outreach meetings throughout this process, and those have been happening going back to the beginning of it. And I have not attended those meetings, but my understanding is that some of them have been sparsely attended in some of the communities that they've gone to. So I think they have been making some attempts to do that, but I'm not sure that those meetings haven't necessarily been specifically focused on equity. They've been broader, about the grid planning process in general. So I think there needs to be more of a focus on this particular area to figure out what, they want to include. It'd be great to hear from somebody from the utilities. I don't know if anyone's on this call. It doesn't look like it, but what types of information they've been hearing or how they've been going about it through the outreach that they have done.
Yeah, and I'll just supplement that a bit, Shay, and say that, as we go through this for the first time, I think it's important to revisit what's included in each milestone. Like, to me, it doesn't feel like equity has been sort of left for last in being in milestone 3, because milestone 1 is the establishment of what forecasting tools we're going to use to develop the model. And so, okay, what's the data that we're including? And then milestone 2, as I understand it in my conversations with the utilities, will be looking at the grid as a whole. And then milestone 3 will be digging into solutions and proposing those at a community level. So I think that it sort of tracks how we're setting this up in a first run of like, okay, let's get agreement on what the data we're putting into this model is. And then really we can dig in and look at a local level and see what the solution is. Does it make sense? Is it equitable? And do all of that in a way that allows for a more robust dialogue. And I think the utilities are appropriately preparing for the most robust community conversation in milestone 3. Milestone 1 was really technically heavy and not something that many folks off the street, and even many of us in the industry, could really follow. I mean, I was thankful that we had technical expertise supporting our office in reviewing that, because it is really heavy. And I think when we're talking about solutions at the community level and evaluating that for equity, I think milestone 3 is really where that is, and that they're gearing up appropriately for that. So I just want to acknowledge, I don't want the impression to be that it's being left for last because it's not a priority. I think we're still developing what our inputs are, and then working our way towards solutions and evaluating those in a more holistic way.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to have some foundation, right, in order to have those conversations. That totally makes sense. Steve?
Yeah, that's a good point. I agree with all that Kira was saying. I think, in terms of the inputs too, like the inputs into the forecasting include like the forecasts for DERs under different, low and high or whatever scenarios that they're using and things like that. So there is data that goes in there. I think there's also, been a lot of discussion about what level of sort of geographic granularity they want to include in the information. And that's going to be important for how that maps out compared to using some of these mapping tools for EJ communities, which the utilities had talked about potentially using in their comments. So yeah, it's kind of an iterative process. I don't think they've completely left it out, but at the same time, I haven't heard any specific details about it when I've asked questions about it. So. But they've also been open to, they've said like, yeah, we'd love to meet with you and hear your feedback. So, hopefully that will happen.
That too. No problem. Thank you so much, Kira. Okay. Yeah. So that totally makes sense, Steve. Yeah, I really appreciate those comments. I have the same thought, I think, that you mentioned when it comes to certain forecasting decisions, certain data aggregation or input determination that can have, especially when it comes to granularity, geographical and spatial and temporal granularity. Those are all, variables that are really important and can have drastic impacts on the final decision-making process. And so that's why I kind of had those initial concerns that if that decision in terms of, spatial granularity is made early in the process, it may overlook and then lead to, areas in which people aren't fully seen later on in the process when you're asking that equity question. When you're asking, like Kira's question about the certain age group that they're concerned about, how do you address that group without granularity sufficient to give visibility to them, things like that. So really appreciate that. And I guess finally, we'll see if anyone has any thoughts on challenges, solutions, and opportunities in terms of investment prioritization. Have there been, in Maine in particular, issues related to electrification and investing or prioritizing the investment as it comes to this IGP process into certain communities? I know we're still early in the process, it still hasn't reached phase 3, but if anyone has any thoughts into what challenges might occur as we try to prioritize investments into certain areas. No worries, no worries. I
Well,
think one
I
thing.
mean,
Oh, go ahead.
I think part of this gets back to the last meeting we had on hosting capacity and that type of thing where, like being able to identify areas in the grid that need investments where there's sort of limits on the grid, especially where they might overlap with some of the, low income or EJ community areas. And, again, like we also have the data from Efficiency Maine that can show like where has some of the incentives gone, have they gone to those areas? Should there be more of a focus on trying to increase uptake in those areas? And I know like Efficiency Maine programs, they do offer higher incentives for heat pumps and other things for low income communities. So they're trying to incentivize it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an uptake in those areas, or there's limits on the capacity of the grid in some of these places where investments might make sense, and not just for electrification reasons, but also for could make sense for reliability reasons too. So there's sort of overlapping objectives that should be considered for those areas.
Be honest, I think you actually did the thing I was talking about earlier, the intersection, which I think is awesome, recognizing that in order to invest properly, you might have to invest into some better data understanding of the intersection across different variables. And you highlighted both reliability and capacity being an important intersection that currently isn't, I'm sure, visible in Maine, right? Can you currently understand or easily determine where capacity constraints exist for DER deployment or electrification, as well as where reliability differentials currently exist in that particular community? That's an intersection that needs to be identified and needs to be addressed through better data transparency. And that's where you have things like in Minnesota with host capacity maps that have reliability maps tabbed over them as well, allowing you to see those intersections and see where both those issues occur. That is definitely a highest priority list, right? A great way to quantify or proceduralize the prioritization effort based on two specific variables. Reliability depends on what metric, and host capacity as it pertains to today. I think the additional challenge there would be then alleviating or addressing concerns about the forecasting challenges that may occur with that. So if there's an area that has those two discrepancies, but has forecasts that from a historical perspective would not be will not reach, as we talked about last time, proactive host capacity will not grow in demand in a significant amount of time. Is it therefore still reasonable to prioritize that area? And I think recognizing that, yeah, I think that's where we get into a little bit more of the details of maybe the grid equity assessments in terms of aligning reliability or weighting reliability concerns, proactive host capacity concerns, electrification concerns, and now forecasting concerns in those areas, and as a team deciding as a group how to best prioritize those effectively. But yeah, just highlighting that's definitely a challenge area.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up too, because I think, there's still an open question about when you say waiting, I think the commission ended up opting for a more of a qualitative kind of scorecard approach for the grid plans that would, you know, try to weight different criteria, but, you know, it's obviously not a completely objective process. It's a subjective process in some ways. So that's going to be an important part of you know, how that decision making occurs. You know, how they weight these different priorities and different um, you know, to determine what kinds of investments need to be made.
Absolutely. So with that, I'll move on to our final section. Again, really appreciate everyone's comments there. Really, really informative. And obviously, this is not a necessarily defining solution section. This is just kind of evaluating a lot of how to really think about the opportunity areas that could be improved upon to you know, enable and hopefully address some of the solutions that make hopefully the grid more equitable. So we'll jump 2 slides and we'll go to our final section, which is grid equity assessments and developing regulatory oversight process. And so here I'm just going to define, you know, some of the aspects of grid equity assessments as they've been performed today. And talk about where we as IREC want to go within the topic of understanding this particular range of, you know, new range of regulatory investigation and discovery, I guess you could say, in this process. So yeah, let's go ahead with definition first. Grid equity assessments is evaluating the current condition of the grid and the differential capabilities it provides to customers through an equity lens. I really want to hammer on that point of capabilities, which I think is both a great way to understand and digest the ramifications of certain investments, as well as a great communication mechanism, a way to communicate why host capacity is important, why ACME reliability value is important, why disconnection rates are important, right? It's because it's how it impacts people and the capabilities and the way they interact with the grid. So I want to highlight that there. But, you know, from a good equity assessment, there are, you know, 2 main buckets, right? Quantitative and qualitative is in any assessment process. Qualitative, it sounds like, has been a pretty strong suit in Maine from, you know, different public engagement sessions and particularly, like you mentioned, Steve, a self-assessment, it sounded like, in terms of determining from a subjective point of view, how well are we doing on these topics, on these issues. So and that also is alignment with like IEJ's scorecard, IEJ's the energy justice scorecard, aligned with the self-assessment process. And there's also the quantitative aspect, you know, which relates to actually looking at specific conditions. We're thinking about equipment monitoring on a sufficiently granular basis. And then we're thinking about performing statistical correlations to determine where disparities exist. And that allows then for you know, understanding of the problem and then addressing it through prioritization. Click next slide or click, thank you. But there's also a highlight that these also interact with one another and in important ways that need to be highlighted from a qualitative standpoint or from quantitative influencing qualitative. There's one benefit, sorry, another mosquito. There's one benefit that's really important, which is the scale of disparities in the conversation, right? So being able to give voice to or give scale to the qualitative impacts that are and stories that communities experience, especially when it comes to reliability, is really important. And also focused engagement. I'll highlight the study from CMU, which that identifies intersectional vulnerabilities between different classes or different demographic and different age-related classes, and how important that is for determining where we need to invest more time in discussing and communicating with the community on what challenges they may see and how to invest in address their needs, as especially as the climate's changing. From the quantitative standpoint, we have qualitative influencing quantitative through first capability objectives and goals. There's no point in investing in electric vehicle infrastructure if a community has identified it is not on their priority list. And so recognize or in certain housing real electrification efforts, it's really important to incorporate exactly what the communities want and what capabilities they want to how they want to interact with the grid today and into the future. And then finally, one of the most interesting ones is behavioral adjustments. For those who aren't familiar, what this is referring to is a lot of it's called the energy equity gap, quantified and developed by Destinock at Carnegie Mellon and a few other researchers. But it's recognizing that even if you take into account, the objective of energy burden assessments and identifying that certain communities at a certain percentage of their income would be considered energy burdened, it does not and overlooks the fact, very similar to what Kiera was saying earlier, that you will have certain communities that already instinctively have changed their behavior and the way they interact with electricity in their system in their homes in order to avoid becoming energy burdened, and therefore introducing themselves to problems, introducing themselves to vulnerabilities, to heat stroke, to winter, too cold days, things like that, because they are used to kind of, going through this level, putting themselves through the level of suffering to avoid becoming or having an economical strain. And so you have to go beyond just monitoring electric usage data. You have to look into, intersection of electric usage data and, home energy efficiency programs, and current infrastructure, building infrastructure. And then also, reflecting, if you can look at perform some quantitative assessment and see how some of these households are maybe not responding like their neighbors, but likely should, because it's making themselves vulnerable. So with that, I'm going to go through a couple examples of some of these assessments. Next slide. These are the four main ones, but there are a few other studies that have investigated some of these issues. So Minnesota, I've quoted a few times. Michigan has had similar impact or significant impact in Michigan in their efforts. Arizona is one of the first ever efforts and implementations of the energy equity gap and consumption rate design or consumption rate investigation across different demographic intersections. And then finally, our report in Ohio that examines service infrastructure conditions and reliability and host capacity. Next slide. So first and foremost, I'm hoping, by the way, I hope this kind of section gives some ideas into what are the metrics or components that should be investigated in the IGP process in Maine by following some of the work that has been done elsewhere. But first is recognizing the importance of infrastructure, condition, and characteristics. So in our report in Ohio, an investigation on discrepancies between the types of infrastructure located in certain communities versus others, using either CGIS designated variables like disadvantaged indicator, redlining status was investigated here, so impacts of historical redlining, and then other demographic related data as well. And so like BIPOC population size and things like that are really important. This could be applied across age as well. I think that's going to be a really actually important component of Maine's investigatory efforts, is understanding if there are correlations between vulnerable populations from an age or medically vulnerable perspective to the quality and condition of infrastructure. Because if that quality is low, this is voltage class, so it's not necessarily, but if the age is high, or of the infrastructure, so it's old infrastructure, or certain types of investments haven't been made that have been monitored and tracked, like certain grid modernization efforts, and that the community is becoming increasingly vulnerable to certain climate related risk, right? And so that could be a main concern. Service quality is a big one. This is from University of Minnesota, a linear regression model for long duration service disruptions, using the Sealy metric, that's customers experiencing long interruptions of longer than 12 hours, and quantifying that. And so this is doing it by across several different demographics. But this is a great way to, again, assess whether or not service quality, reliability, and the outage experience of certain customers is differential across certain groups. Does the current regulatory compact and things that we do and that we assessed currently actually leave people behind and experiencing worse? And does it rely, or does it align across certain demographic or socioeconomic variables like race, like poverty, like household income level, and the like. And so their analysis found this insignificant some certain reliability differentials in certain territories versus others. My own, by the way, service quality investigation in Ohio actually found the opposite, that reliability was actually higher in redlined and disadvantaged communities, which is a fine result as well. But asking the question is really important, as those communities are more vulnerable to the impacts of those outages and therefore need to be addressed. So this is a great way to seek, from a service quality perspective, start identifying and prioritizing, at least giving visibility to where investments should be prioritized and advocated for. Next slide. Then we get into some of the, again, a little bit, this is information is a little beyond me. These reports are really complicated and really, really detailed and really incredible. So I highly recommend checking out CMU's work, Destiny Knox work. But on the left, you have, a more detailed energy burden assessment. And so what this does, it examines and creates a nice little, I think, graphic to understand that sometimes energy burden related variables or impacts, or where energy burden is spiking across populations, is not just within one subgroup, but across the intersection of certain groups, right? So whether it's from an income level, in which you see, especially here, you see all red dots across the top line, which is $15,000 or less. So people who are impoverished are experiencing energy burden. No shock there, like that is a target audience. But you also see down at the bottom, like you can see like some of the yellow dots kind of appeared some like interesting areas, such as maybe like a Hispanic population around a certain level is more secure, or certain age groups, let's say like 65 and older, Hispanic populations are very energy burdened compared to other groups in that area. So compared to Asian Americans or Black Americans as well. So that is identifying the intersection of these energy burdens can allow for, again, better investment prioritization, but also from that qualitative sense allows for better and focused engagement with those communities. So now, in recognizing that cross section, you can now target and investigate and learn what are the barriers to clean energy deployment, what are the barriers to electrification, what are other policy objectives and measures that we can deploy to target that specific community, all because we are looking at energy and how people interact with energy beyond just what they're paying on their bills. Steve?
Yeah, do you know by chance how they're quantifying energy burden in this case? Are they only looking at electricity use, or are they looking more broadly at sort of household energy use? I mean, this was something, I was also on one of the working groups for the climate action plan. We had one of our recommendations was around energy burden that's in the plan. And we made sure that, or I made sure anyways, that it reflected a broader range of energy costs. Because as I was saying earlier, to the extent that, we're encouraging electrification, your electricity bills are going to go up and be a higher percentage of your overall energy bill, but your other costs are going to go down. So that's important to reflect in there. And I'm just curious, when it's involving just a utility, they might only, look at electricity, or maybe electricity and natural gas use in particular states. So just curious about that for Arizona.
Great question. I do not have that answer. I'll definitely take a look at the report, and we share the report details as well. But I'll also shoot Destiny, Dr. Knock, a message and see if she can answer that for you as well. Definitely put you in touch. I think she'd be a great resource to ask any host of
Yeah,
questions related to energy burden assessments like this.
I know her. Yeah, thank you. I
Okay,
might
cool.
have
Never mind.
before. I think she actually might have written a blog for us too. We
Oh,
did some
okay,
work with
awesome.
her. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, she's wonderful. Yeah, and absolutely brilliant. Again, and a lot of her, as you know, a lot of her work focuses not on just identifying these intersections, but recognizing that, yeah, that energy burden, even if it sometimes, like you said, overlooks the diversity of energy resources. It also can overlook diversity of behaviors associated with energy burden reduction. And then finally, on the right, we have cooling needs. That very much same idea, but recognizing that there are potentially differentials in how certain populations utilize energy and how they may change the utilization of energy as climate changes. So another important perspective to consider. This is in alignment with Kiera was saying that certain higher vulnerable, like older populations, may use energy at a higher rate than other customers. And so recognizing that difference, that differential, and also recognizing that they may need additional cooling needs just due to their vulnerability is a really important perspective. Also, the final one I'll say is host capacity. Next slide. It's part of analysis in Ohio. So this is recognizing that if we consider, you know, host capacity and even proactive host capacity as an objective and a capability that we'd like to see in IDP, that there are ways to perform, you know, and identify whether there are disparities across certain groups, and then therefore, in recognizing it, identify then that there's a need for targeted investment or at least detailed investigation into forecast in those areas to better account for the current basically disenfranchisement or the inability of those communities to adopt clean energy at the same rates as other communities. I'll highlight that this is not the only variable that is important here. It's also interconnection data that should be incorporated and interconnection cost data, as well as service condition data as well, and aligning those variables again from looking at the weighting across multiple variables across each of these kind of topic areas is really important in investigating whether or not, you know, prioritization should occur and if the need is really ultimately required. Next slide. So with that, I know I guess we're almost at time, but if anyone wants to, you know, plug in or have any final thoughts before we get ready to close out, let's see if you had any thoughts about what grid equity assessments, what roles they can play in Maine, and what metrics potentially you are most interested in investigating and pulling from all these other resources that have been performed.
Sorry, having trouble with my thing. I can try to answer the second question. I'm sorry I'm doing all the talking, but it doesn't look like there's too many people on this call. So, you know, again, in the comments that we submitted to the commission on the grid planning process, whatever, before they put out the order, we definitely listed some specific quantitative metrics, things like the amount of funding and investments that are going to happen in energy efficiency, weatherization, solar storage, heat pumps, other DERs, grid infrastructure that are made in those communities. We did talk about quantifying energy burden too. We also talked about lower environmental burdens, since, you know, the assessment that's required in Maine is, you know, is broader than just an EJ assessment. It's also an environmental assessment. So trying to quantify any emission reductions that occur due to some of those investments in efficiency and DERs and so forth, and provided some examples of how they could quantify those benefits in terms of public health benefits and not just emissions, but other benefits that would be important to understand for those communities. As you talked about earlier, increased reliability and resiliency. So, you know, how some of those investments would build resilience in local communities, and some of that could be through, you know, non-wires investments, storage, distributed solar, microgrids, that type of thing, but also using some of the indexes that the utilities use, like SAIDI and the other one, System Average Interruption Duration Index and System Average Interruption Frequency Index, and trying to use that at the census tract level, which sort of corresponds with some of the assessment tools that are out there. And then we also suggested quantifying procedural equity too, which is more basic types of quantitative things like, you know, the number of stakeholder events they had, how many participants were involved, how much money they spent on engaging with organizations and residents in disadvantaged communities, how the input was used to inform their grid plans, that type of thing. So those were the things that we highlighted, but you know, we also provided examples from some of the federal programs at the time from the Environmental Justice 40 initiative. There was some of the federal agencies that develop guidance in terms of how to implement the Justice 40 initiative that were applicable to utilities in Maine and in other places. The examples that we used at the state level were for not any of the states that you mentioned, but California, Illinois, New York, Oregon, and Washington. And those are all in our comments that we filed, but I'm really glad to see these other resources that you've identified more recently. And I know UCS, for example, has been very active in Minnesota and Michigan too. So I'm glad to see that there's some stuff there. We offered some other examples from those states for the grid planning process that were not necessarily equity related, but other parts of the grid planning process that we think those states are doing really well with. So it's good to see some more details there, and thank you for putting the links in the chat. Good to have.
Thanks so much, Steve. I'm definitely going to read through your specific submittal as soon as possible, because I know you all did an immense amount of work and are definitely leaders in this space. So we're happy to it was excited to learn from you all today and share whatever resources that we were able to share today as well. I'll go to the final slide. Yeah, just final next steps. I'll pass it over to Vaughn.
Great. Thank you, Shay. And thank you. Yeah, thank you all for the participation here. As it relates to this specific workshop, we will, as mentioned at the top, send around slides and the recording to attendees that had signed up. In addition, we'll be publishing issue briefs on this topic and the proactive hosting capacity and cost allocation topics from the last presentation later on this year. And then I guess, given that this is our last workshop with Maine stakeholders, and want to thank the Bar Foundation and Tilia Fund who have helped fund our work here. Just want to leave it that, I mean, we've had kind of a tight-knit group of folks who are here, I know, working on these issues. And if there are opportunities where we can, not in the detailed manner that we might under more expanded funding, but if there's a way that we can connect you with resources, would highly recommend reaching out to us to have a conversation. You know, we can have offline one-on-one conversations to hear what your considerations are, whether you're folks who are here with us now or listening to the recording, just to see how we can help assist this process with the resources that we have. With that, thank you all very much, and enjoy the cool down rest of the week.